Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Richard Bell. I'm a professor of history at the University of Maryland, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Treaty of Paris. So let's get started. America's peace commissioners signed the final version of the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War and confirming the independence of the United States on September the 3rd, 1783, in an upstairs room at the Hotel de York on the left bank of the City of Lights. The treaty redrew almost every boundary line on the North American continent, doubling the size of the newly United States as a result, and making it the largest republic on the face of the planet. John Adams was one of the commissioners responsible for the treaty. Never prone to understatement, John Adams described that agreement that he had helped to forge in Paris over the previous 12 months as one of the most important political events that ever happened on this globe. As soon as the ink was dry, that September morning, the King of France declared it a holiday, a day of thanksgiving for world peace. The king distributed great quantities of wine and sausages to the people of Paris, and there was dancing in the streets. Then came the toasts, dozens of them, some to John Adams and to the other treaty makers, but most to the hero of the hour, the Prince of Peace himself, Benjamin Franklin. A few days later, the Montgolfier brothers demonstrated a successful balloon ascent over Paris and quickly began sightseeing rides high above the city. Ben Franklin watched those remarkable sky-faring voyages from a spot on the banks of the River Seine. And to him, these two events, the peace and then the flights, must have seemed connected. Both were marvelous, wondrous, revolutionary beginnings. Both were portents of a new and bright global order filled with possibility and hope. We have it in our power to begin the world anew. Tom Paine had written many years earlier at the start of the American Revolution. Now, in Paris in 1783, it seemed to Ben Franklin that the dawn of that new world was finally breaking. The war for independence had been a global war. It had spread far beyond Boston, Massachusetts, where it began, to include and encompass military confrontations across the continent, as well as in Europe, Africa, Central America, and at sea in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. In fact, the American Revolution was at least 4 distinct wars rolled into one. First, a war by the Patriots against Great Britain for independence. Second, by France to upend the balance of power in Europe. Third, by Spain to recover territory lost in prior wars. And fourth, by fugitives from slavery and Native Americans against the Patriots to achieve freedom and sovereignty. But in the wake of the 1781 Battle of Yorktown, neither the Patriots nor any of the grand European powers wanted this war to continue on a moment longer. Too many lives had been lost. Too much money had been spent. So negotiations to end the war began shortly after Yorktown. The Continental Congress, at the insistence of its partners in Paris, gave its peace commissioners strict instructions to coordinate their diplomacy with the French government and order them not to make a bilateral deal with London. And yet, the story of the 1783 Treaty of Paris is the story of why, when, and how those American peace commissioners decided to ignore those instructions and instead forge a separate peace with Britain without interference from France or Spain or anyone else. The central character in this great drama was Franklin, the lead negotiator on the American side, the son around whom all the other planet-sized egos in this story revolved. Franklin had been in Paris since 1776, serving as minister plenipotentiary. By 1782, he could draw upon 6 years of contacts, experience, and personal relationships with all the continent's power brokers. He was the right man for the job. His French counterpart, this man, the Comte de Vergennes, was a man he knew well. Vergennes was the foreign secretary and de facto first minister of the French government, and was authorized to speak on behalf of America's other wartime allies, Spain and the Netherlands, during any multilateral talks. The British envoy was this man, Richard Oswald. This is an earlier painting, but in the 1780s, he was a fairly elderly Scotsman with no prior diplomatic experience. But he had considerable skills as a conciliator and was a personal friend of Franklin. Oswald reported directly to the incoming British Prime Minister, this man, Lord Shelburne, a politician with a reputation for flexibility and machination, and a long-standing sympathy for the colonists and their grievances. Britain, France, and the rebel government now calling itself the United States all wanted peace, but for widely different reasons. Richard Oswald and British Prime Minister Lord Shelburne wanted peace in order to free up the empire's armed forces, to fight off other threats, and to create the conditions for a resumption of trade between Britain and her former colonies. For his part, the Comte de Vergennes wanted peace so that France could start to dig its way out of its deep war debts. He also wanted to help the Americans secure their independence as a way to forge new trading links for France and to check the power of Britain's ever-growing empire. Ben Franklin wanted all that as well. Yet Franklin also hoped to play Britain, France, and Spain against one another in order to try to secure dramatic territorial gains for the fledgling United States. Informal peace talks began in Paris in April of 1782 when Richard Oswald arrived from London. Oswald visited Franklin at his home in Passy on April the 12th, and they went together to Versailles to meet Vergennes. Next, Franklin dispatched letters to Madrid and Amsterdam, urging the American envoys there, John Jay and John Adams, to come join him in Paris for the start of these much-anticipated peace talks. "Come hither as soon as possible," Franklin wrote. In the meantime, Franklin and Oswald, the British envoy, negotiated privately. On July the 10th, Franklin delivered Oswald a list of 8 desired outcomes. 4 of them, Franklin said, were deal-breaking necessities. Here they are. First, the United States wants full and complete independence and the total withdrawal of British troops from the US. Second, we want new and enlarged US territorial boundaries. Third, we seek the confinement of Canada's boundaries to pre-war limits. And fourth, we seek fishing rights for US fishermen off Newfoundland. To that list, Franklin also tacked on 4 more demands: acknowledgement of British war guilt, reparations to the United States, the extension of US sovereignty to Canada, and a free trade customs union between Britain and America. Although Franklin signaled that that second set of terms were of secondary importance to the first. Oswald dutifully reported all of that, and it was a lot, to London. In a cover letter, Oswald advised his boss, Lord Shelburne, that if he granted the first 4 terms, Franklin would probably drop the rest and would likely be willing to give Britain what it wanted most: bilateral talks, just the 2 of them, and a speedy settlement. The rest of that summer in Paris was unusually wet. But things moved forward. The players met publicly. The players met secretly. They spied on each other. They leaked disinformation. All the while, Ben Franklin flirted with his beautiful young neighbor at Passy, Madame Briand. John Jay had arrived in Paris from Madrid in June, but he'd promptly fallen ill with influenza. In August, Franklin too took to his bed, undone by a severe bout of kidney stones made worse by his gout. It was serious. Rumors circulated that he'd suffered a stroke and was paralyzed. By then, John Jay, the other peace commissioner, had recovered, and so it was he that now took over the peace commission's daily work from Franklin. And John Jay was a gifted lawyer, ambitious and confident, but also serious, often grave. To admirers of Franklin's wit and warmth, like Vergennes and his Spanish counterpart, the Conde de Aranda, this changing of the guard among the American delegates that summer must have seemed abrupt and wrenching. John Jay, the new guy, spoke neither French nor Spanish, and he regarded both nations with extreme distrust. Aranda, the Spanish envoy, now suggested that everything west of the Appalachian Mountains be ceded to Spain, and that the United States be confined to the territory east of those mountains, along the eastern seaboard. But John Jay ignored him, poring over the same 1755 map of the continent that they'd all been furnished with at the start of these talks. Vergennes, the French minister, then proposed a compromise. Spain would get the Deep South, west of the Appalachians. The United States would get Tennessee and Kentucky, and Britain would get to hold on to the Ohio country and the Great Lakes. John Jay ignored him too. John Jay turned instead to the British envoy, insisting to Oswald that the 2,000-mile length of the Mississippi River in the middle of the continent, that must be the new western boundary of the United States. Here, Oswald, the British envoy, saw his chance. And so he now spent this summer trying to drive a deep wedge between the American commissioners and their wartime allies, France and Spain. Between them, Jay and Oswald now slowly turned what had been intended as multilateral negotiations into bilateral talks that excluded both France and Spain. To secure that exclusivity, Richard Oswald worked with his boss, Lord Shelburne, to deliver some upfront concessions to US interests. Lord Shelburne himself was in a hurry to get a deal while Parliament was still on summer recess. And so in August 1782, Shelburne, as the Prime Minister, publicly acknowledged the fact of American independence, a grand gesture of good faith. Shelburne also sent word to John Jay, the American Peace Commissioner, that Britain would consent to the use of Ben Franklin's 4 necessities as the basis for drafting a final deal, so long as the Americans dropped Franklin's secondary list of demands. By September, then, things were moving quickly, and an Anglo-American agreement seemed to be near at hand. John Jay had won a firm offer of peace from the British Prime Minister, predicated upon recognition of US independence, British troop withdrawal, enlarged borders, and guarantees for American fisheries. It seemed all that remained to be decided were the details. Ben Franklin recovered his health at the end of September, and by early October, John Jay produced a draft treaty for everyone to review. It was built around Franklin's 4 necessities, but the text itself was in Jay's handwriting, and his contributions were substantial. According to Jay's draft, the new boundaries of the United States would extend from the Atlantic Ocean in the east, all the way to the Mississippi River in the west, and from the Nipissing Line in the north, which you can see in red at the top of this image, to the 31st line of latitude in the south. Enormous. In return for such generous terms, John Jay had tucked in a new clause offering British merchants freedom of navigation on the Mississippi River, thus affording them a hugely valuable maritime passage to markets in the heart of the continent. Jay had also stifled all further talk of turning British Canada into the 14th State of the Union. But still, it was not all smooth sailing. The talks derailed in a dispute about the precise boundary line on the Maine border, until Ben Franklin stepped in to get them back on track, adding language to Jay's draft treaty that would establish a commission at some future date to resolve the question. Everyone agreed, and the talks resumed. On October the 8th, 1782, Oswald dispatched the draft treaty to London with his own enthusiastic endorsement. But here Shelburne's cabinet balked, furious at the omission of any terms that could secure the payment of debts owed to British merchants, or the recovery of assets confiscated from American loyalists. This would not do. The cabinet now sent a second envoy to join Oswald in Paris, an Under-Secretary of State named Henry Strachey. He was armed with a counter-proposal that insisted on three things. First, on compensation for exiled loyalists and prompt payment of Americans' pre-war debts. Second, on restrictions upon Americans' fishing rights off Newfoundland. And third, on the drawing of a new northern boundary more favorable to British interests than the Nipissing line that Jay had previously proposed. And if that was not setback enough, then John Adams arrived from Amsterdam, throwing everything into chaos and confusion. Now, John Adams was a skilled lawyer, but he was also a human hand grenade, predisposed to superciliousness and suspiciousness of everyone else, especially the French. He refused to listen to anything the Comte de Vergennes had to say, in fact, concluding that the Comte's strategy was to keep us Americans down, if he can, to keep his hand under our chin to prevent us from drowning, but not to lift our heads out of the water. John Adams thought little better of Ben Franklin, dismissing his fellow peace commissioner as a Frenchified dandy, an old conjurer and a snake. For his part, Franklin found his newly arrived colleague to be impossible to deal with, and later characterized Adams as always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. Still, Franklin and Adams and Jay had to work together. So those three headstrong men divided up the tasks, and they got on with it. For the first 2 weeks of November 1782, everyone on the American delegation worked around the clock with their British counterparts, Oswald and Strachey, at various lodgings, hotels across Paris too. John Jay focused on the boundary questions, reluctantly abandoning the Nipissing line as a border with Canada and instead drawing up two more conservative routings for the British to consider. Meanwhile, Ben Franklin focused on the Loyalists and their property claims, adding language to the draft treaty, which I don't have time to discuss right now, but would be happy to talk through during Q&A. John Adams turned first to the question of the war debts and settled the matter by offering valuable concessions to the British. And after that, Adams focused his energies on the fisheries, a subject near and dear to his New England heart. Adams badgered Richard Oswald, the British envoy, to extend American fishing rights all the way to the Gulf of the St. Lawrence River and to all other places where the inhabitants of both countries used, at any time heretofore, to fish. Their negotiations were exhausting. Dealing with John Adams is exhausting. But Adams ultimately got his way. At dinner later, a colleague asked him if he wanted to eat fish for his main course. No, Adams laughed. I've had a pretty good meal of them today. I'm glad to hear it, his dining companion replied, as I know that a small quantity would not satisfy you. On November the 25th, a final round of talks began in Paris. The Americans now offered slightly more generous terms for the repayment of debts to British merchants. Then Henry Lawrence arrived to take up his role as the fourth American Peace Commissioner. Lawrence, a South Carolina merchant who'd been imprisoned in the Tower of London until quite recently, took it upon himself to add a brand new clause to the treaty, preventing the evacuation of fugitive slaves from America. A clause about which I'll say some more in a few minutes. But everything else remained unchanged. So on November the 30th, 1782, British and American peacemakers gathered in Richard Oswald's suite at the Grand Hotel Muscovite to sign two identical copies of this provisional peace agreement. Oswald signed first, as he represented Britain, the more venerable nation. Then each of the four American peace commissioners signed in strict alphabetical order. Once the two secretaries had added their names, they affixed the seals and then dispatched one copy to Annapolis, the temporary capital of the United States. The other went to Westminster, post haste. The treaty was to remain provisional until other bilateral agreements between Britain and France and then Britain and Spain could be hashed out. And as you can see here, that took time. But finally, 10 months later, in September 1783, the peace commissioners gathered again to sign the definitive version of this Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War and confirming the independence of the United States. Everyone feasted and toasted the occasion. And a few days later, those momentous balloon flights began over the rooftops of the French capital. The Treaty of Paris and its auxiliary agreements together shook geopolitics like an earthquake and generated both winners and losers. Some of the losers were obvious. The Netherlands, Spain, and France limped from the peace talks. The Netherlands won nothing of substance in Paris. Spain did gain Florida and a tiny Mediterranean island named Minorca, but Britain retained Gibraltar, the rocky promontory at Spain's southern tip, ensuring that the Royal Navy would continue to prowl the waters of southern Europe for decades to come. The Comte de Vergennes had come to the peace talks with the highest of hopes for himself and for France, expecting to be the power broker at the center of it all. But as we've heard, Franklin and Jay had sidelined him quickly in order to deal directly with the British. And the final settlement left the French largely out in the cold. In fact, when he learned that the provisional treaty had been agreed without him, Vergennes was furious. He scolded Franklin, "You have fixed the preliminary articles without informing us." Franklin, the old conjurer, was too polite to shrug, but his tepid apology to the Comte for this faux pas amounted to the same. Vergennes was no doubt pleased to see the size of King George's empire trimmed substantially. And France itself did gain Tobago in the Caribbean and Senegal in West Africa from the British. But France had little else to show for itself. Shelburne had ceded none of Britain's possessions in India, as Vergennes had once hoped. And France left the peace table substantially weakened, still carrying the deep debts it had taken on to finance the American war. By rights, of course, Britain too should loom large on any list of losers in the Paris peace talks. The deal that Oswald and Sherburne had made certainly stuck in many Englishmen's throats when they learned its details, and King George himself seemed to choke on it. On December the 5th, 1782, he delivered a royal address to Parliament. A witness later reported that the words "free and independent" seemed to catch in the king's throat as he described the terms of the peace that his prime minister had made with the United States. That prime minister, Lord Shelburne, soon paid a price. 3 months later, a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons forced Shelburne to resign. His government fell, and Shelburne never held political office again. It seemed for all the world that proud Britannia had been thrown from her horse. Britain lost 16 New World colonies in all, 13 of them to the newly independent United States. Yet closer inspection reveals that Britain had also made substantial territorial gains, including Grenada, the Bahamas, the Grenadines, Dominica, St. Christopher, Nevis, and Montserrat. In fact, Shelburne had consolidated Britain's hold over much of the Caribbean, and all while thwarting rivals' designs on India and Canada. Proud Britannia would live to fight another day. Indeed, Lord Shelburne had played the long game, gambling that offering such generous terms to the United States would erode the Franco-American alliance, block Spanish ambitions on the North American continent, help to restore friendly relations between Britain and America, and accelerate the resumption of trade between those two nations. And you know what? It did. As Shelburne had predicted, the United States would remain very economically dependent on Great Britain for decades to come. British hopes that the American experiment in self-government would quickly collapse, leaving Britain to rush in to restore control, those hopes were never realized. But the return of amity and commerce was compensation enough, and the United States remained in the British sphere of influence for the foreseeable future. At a party at Ben Franklin's house in Passy, a Frenchman later tried to taunt a member of Richard Oswald's staff with the prospect that the US would one day rise to become an empire all its own. But to the Frenchman's surprise, the British official seemed delighted at that prospect. "Yes," he replied, "and they will all speak English, every one of them." Most scholars, of course, regard the prime victor in the contest to secure the best terms of the peace to be the United States of America. With independence now recognized by all of Europe's leading powers, the United States became the newest, youngest member of the family of nations. Britain had granted generous fishing rights and had promised to remove its troops with all convenient speed from American soil. And that soil now stretched all the way to the banks of the mighty Mississippi, a vast swathe of new territory in the West that today forms all or part of 11 US states. Securing such expansive borders was the American commissioner's greatest feat, part and parcel of a peace settlement more favorable than any of them could ever hoped for. John Adams, the most undiplomatic of diplomats, told correspondents back in America that these terms bore the mark of his own genius, shrewdness, and skill. "We were better tacticians than was imagined," Adams said. That self-serving assessment conveniently ignored the important fact that Britain had been anxious to settle, but Adams nonetheless captured an essential truth: that skepticism and toughness, patience and flexibility had served this team of rivals well. The resulting peace pact was an extraordinary achievement for the American commissioners, a triumph that was noteworthy both for its durability and its far-reaching impact. To commemorate the triumphal signing of the Treaty of Paris, the Pennsylvania Assembly appropriated £600 for a party and a parade in downtown Philadelphia, and commissioned the famous painter Charles Willson Peale to build a 50-foot-high Roman-style arch on the high street. Peale spent weeks designing and building it, adorning the enormous edifice with suitable inscriptions like this one, and several massive paintings, including at least one of General George Washington. But then, on the night of the celebration, January the 22nd, 1784, tragedy struck in Philadelphia. A rocket intended as part of the fireworks display went off prematurely. It set the paper and canvas covering the arch's frame in flames. Charles Willson Peale, its architect, was standing on top of it when this hulking thing caught fire, and he broke 2 of his ribs as he fell, and it collapsed on top of him. Several spectators sustained burns of their own, and an artillery sergeant was killed. That grand celebration, disfigured by disaster, is, I think, a useful prompt for all of us to pause at this point in this heroic narrative about the Treaty of Paris and its global legacies, and to consider the possibility that its consequences were more dangerous and more unpredictable than I've so far suggested in this talk. In France, the treaty had been toasted with wine and sausages and balloon rides, as if it marked the birth of a new world order. And when it came to land and trade and fish, yeah, it certainly seemed to. But if we focus on the people whose lives the Treaty of Paris changed, its impacts seem much more ambivalent and ambiguous. Like the triumphal arch that collapsed on some of its spectators in Philadelphia, the provisions of the 1783 Treaty of Paris certainly caused injury to a great many communities. So in the time I have left, I want to introduce you to 2 of those communities: Black fugitives from slavery and British allied Native Americans. As you may remember, the 4th US Peace Commissioner, Henry Laurens, had scribbled a new clause into the margins of the provisional treaty on the very last day of the negotiations. That clause prohibited British forces from carrying away any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. This scratch of Laurens' pen sought to halt the evacuation of the many thousands of runaway slaves who had fled to British lines during the war, and instead allow their former masters to reclaim, recapture, and re-enslave them. Now, let me explain what all that was about. 7 years earlier, in November 1775, this man, Lord Dunmore, the commander of British forces in Virginia, had issued a proclamation promising lifelong freedom to any enslaved man of fighting age who would desert his patriot enslaver and come over and fight for the king. Within the first month alone, 300 Black people fled to Dunmore's fleet. And by 1782, there were many thousands of fugitives from slavery sheltering behind British lines, including those who had escaped plantations owned by James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. To earn their keep behind British lines, they staffed British hospitals in occupied New York and tended to the wounded. They did construction work in naval yards. They hauled provisions and collected firewood. They took in laundry and sewed uniforms. They waited on British officers and cooked their meals. More and more Black fugitives arrived every day. In Article 7 of the Treaty of Paris, Henry Laurens, Charleston's leading slave merchant, had demanded that the British return these fugitives to their former owners. The British envoy, Richard Oswald, had not objected to that last-minute addition, and so the clause had been added with little debate or fanfare. A reflection, perhaps, of Oswald's close personal and financial ties to Henry Lawrence. It was Oswald, believe it or not, who had furnished the £50,000 bail that had secured Henry Lawrence's release from the Tower of London in December 1781. And these two men had long been business partners in a transatlantic slave shipping operation. The news that the provisional treaty would thwart the hopes for freedom of New York's black refugees and cast them back into slavery was devastating. One former slave who had taken refuge in Manhattan later recalled that this dreadful rumor filled us all with inexpressible anguish and terror, especially when we saw our old masters coming from Virginia, North Carolina, and other parts, and seizing upon their slaves in the streets of New York, or even dragging them out of their beds. Many of the slaves had very cruel masters, so that the thoughts of returning home with them embittered life to us. For some days we lost our appetite for food, and sleep departed from our eyes. Mercifully, the British commander in New York, this guy, Guy Carleton, his name is, had other ideas. Carleton refused to carry out the clause that Henry Lawrence had added to the Treaty of Paris, calling it an abomination, calling it a betrayal of the trust that so many fugitive slaves had placed in the British Army during the war. Carleton promptly dispatched a whole fleet of ships to Nova Scotia, carrying hundreds of black refugees and ignoring his treaty obligations to cease and desist. News of that convoy's departure brought down howls of protest from patriot slave owners, congressmen, and state governors. George Washington himself demanded a summit meeting with Carleton, insisting that he suspend all other planned departures. But Carleton refused to budge, telling the Patriot leader that delivering up the Negroes to their former masters would be a dishonorable violation of the public faith. When Washington requested a second parley the next evening, Carleton sent regrets and pleaded illness. The following week, Carleton's valet delivered a letter to Washington explaining that, as far as he was concerned, this Lawrence clause only applied to those who had fled to British lines since the treaty had been signed, and that Carleton fully intended to evacuate every other black refugee who wished to leave revolutionary America. In Virginia, James Madison called Carleton's interpretation of the treaty a palpable and scandalous misconstruction. And he was probably right, but there was nothing Madison or anyone else down there could do except fume. As a token concession to Washington, Carleton did establish a joint Anglo-American commission to hastily adjudicate the claims of aggrieved patriot slave owners. But Carleton's commissioners rarely ruled in the slave owners' favor. Instead, British officials printed up hundreds of certificates of freedom for Manhattan's black refugees and logged their names and ages and the names of their former enslavers in a ledger known to us today as the Book of Negroes. Then, with the backing of his bosses in London, Carleton allowed these laundresses, blacksmiths, carpenters, and ex-field workers, including George Washington's old stable hand Harry, to board transport ships and evacuate New York. More than 3,000 fugitives from slavery left revolutionary America this way in 1783, taking passage aboard British ships to parts of its empire where they would be legally free. Some ended up in Britain itself. Others ended up in the Bahamas or elsewhere in the British Caribbean. The majority sailed to Canada, while hundreds of thousands more remained enslaved in the United States The evacuation of these 1,336 men, 914 women, and 750 children from New York City in 1783 was the largest and most significant act of emancipation in American history prior to the Civil War. However, please don't let my British accent confuse you about my own opinions about this. I want to make clear that the British government had not anticipated any of this, that it had not fought this war to destroy American slavery, and that Britain still oversaw plenty of precious and profitable slave colonies of its own across the rest of its sprawling empire. Nevertheless, leaders in London were quick to recognize the propaganda value of this unprecedented emancipation, and soon embraced their new reputation as liberators. In the years that followed, they began recasting Britain's defeat in the Revolutionary War as a victory for their principle, humanity, and enlightenment. A very self-serving set of arguments. Let me pivot here and turn our attention now to the fate of Native Americans during and after 1783. Many of the native chiefs whose nations had allied with the British during the Long War had urged the king's representatives to remember their interests in the peacemaking. In return for their sacrifices on the king's behalf, the chiefs had expected gratitude, protection, and compensation afterwards, regardless of the war's outcome. But the British administration that had forged those native alliances had fallen from power before the peace talks. And the new Prime Minister, Lord Shelburne, who we've met, he felt no continuing debt of obligation. In fact, no native leaders were invited to the Paris negotiations. And indigenous peoples were not mentioned once in the resulting peace settlement. Yet the 1783 Treaty of Paris was one of the most consequential documents in the history of Native America. A piece of parchment that granted the United States a vast Western empire beyond the Appalachians, at least half of which was occupied by native nations at the time. They had not been consulted. They had not made peace. And they had certainly not surrendered. When native leaders learned of the terms of the Treaty of Paris and the expansive new borders that it granted the United States, they could not believe their ears. Surely, one Creek chief insisted, surely this is a Virginia lie. It was not. Soon British officials appeared at their powwows and council meetings to make farewell addresses, in which they tried to convince native leaders that King George had not abandoned them, that the treaty was fair to all sides, and that the natives should keep a stiff upper lip. As if to quietly acknowledge that the treaty was actually an unforgivable betrayal of native alliances, some British commanders on the ground did agree to settle the loyal Iroquois people over the border in British Canada. But otherwise, the hands were tied. The peacemakers and our enemies have talked away our lands at a rum drinking, Little Turkey of the Overhill Cherokee declared in disgust. Native leaders like Little Turkey continued to protest the Paris settlement. Some wrote letters announcing that they retained full right and title to the lands in question and remained sovereign over them. Britain, they said, had ceded land it had never possessed, either by cession, purchase, or by right of conquest. But those protests fell on deaf ears, and American emissaries mocked the natives for having trusted the British in the first place. In 1784, a Congressional Committee on Indian Affairs determined that the land now claimed by the United States was reasonable compensation for the expenses and alarms to which Britain's native allies have exposed their unoffending neighbors, the United States. A senior officer of the Continental Army, General Philip Schuyler, put it more bluntly in a speech to the Six Nations. We are now masters of this island, Schuyler said, and we can dispose of the lands as we think proper or most convenient to ourselves. And so they did. In the 7 years after the Treaty of Paris, American settlers flooded into the backcountry with renewed vigor and confidence, seizing native lands as the spoils of the war. The white population of Pennsylvania's three westernmost counties surged from around 33,000 people in 1783 to more than 95,000 people in 1790. In other western lands, the story was much the same. Across that expanding frontier, murders, abductions, rapes, horse thefts, and raids on native settlements became a fact of life. For America's indigenous population, these years were years of chaos and crisis. Thanks to the Treaty of Paris, they were stranded behind enemy lines on lands now claimed by the United States. Faced with the prospect of annihilation, natives tried to form one great pan-Indian confederation to resist the encroachment of white settlers onto their land, a sort of United States of Native America. The idea had obvious precedent, as those confederated native chiefs told a US emissary in 1788, Congress could not blame them for such a conduct. Neither ought they to be jealous of them. For what had Congress done but to unite 13 states as one? That confederacy of natives would fight on against the ever-encroaching United States. Led by the Miami chief Little Turtle, this Western Native Confederation scored some impressive victories over the US Army in 1790 and 1791, and did sometimes receive covert support and supplies from the British, who remained officially neutral. But in 1794, US troops finally overwhelmed them at the Battle of Fallen Timbers outside Detroit, where native forces were outnumbered 16-1. Only then, at the Treaty of Greenville the following year, only then did native leaders grudgingly sign a settlement with the United States, ceding most of their remaining Ohio hunting grounds to their enemy as the price for peace. For so many people and communities then, the 1783 Treaty of Paris left a mixed legacy. For many white patriots, including the very talented men who drafted it, the treaty was a triumph. It was the opening of a new era of American independence, expansion, and opportunity. However, for many other ordinary people, the same Treaty of Paris marked a darker, more somber dawn. The treaty left unanswered basic questions like, who is an American? And it cast a looming, and I think lingering shadow over the patriots' wartime sloganeering about equality, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.